Welcome to Leadership Lessons from the Fast Lane, brought to you by the Washington Speakers Bureau. In this space, we will explore some of the most pressing challenges that leaders face today with the world's most respected, innovative, curious, and accomplished thought leaders. We'd like to welcome our host, best-selling author and co-author of the recently published book, Choose Love, Not Fear, a WSB Exclusive speaker for almost 30 years, Gary Heil.
This is Leadership Lessons from the Fast Lane. I'm Gary Heil. Today's guest is Dr. Nancy Koehn. Dr. Koehn is a celebrated historian, a corporate director, and a professor at the Harvard Business School. She's also an internationally acclaimed thought leader. Her work on leadership has challenged many of us to think differently about how to create leaders in the future that are both more human and more effective. She's also the best-selling author of Forged in Crisis: The Making of Five Courageous Leaders, a great leadership tome, entertaining and thought-provoking. Welcome, Nancy. Thanks for spending some time with us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Gary.
Hey, listen, I don't think there's much debate about the fact that everybody thinks they need to lead differently in the future than they have in the past. Innovation's becoming a bigger currency for the future. Everybody wants more engagement. I think what is also true is how few of these conversations are grounded in a definition of leadership that focuses our thinking. I was taken by the definition you used in Forged in Crisis. You used David Foster Wallace's articulation of real leadership, or as you called it, courageous leadership. Is that definition still hold water for you today when we start to talk about how we need to lead differently in the future?
I certainly do, and I encountered David Foster Wallace's definition of leadership in an article written about him a couple of years after he died. So this is the late noughts, and I was just so struck by it. I went back and tried to learn a whole lot about him. That didn't turn out to be so fruitful. He was a novelist and a journalist, but when he took on a subject, as he did in the 2000 presidential campaign, and he was following John McCain around on the campaign bus as McCain tried to get the Republican nomination. He thought deeply about leadership, and in an article he wrote for Rolling Stone, he wrote about the subject, and he said, real leaders are individuals who help us overcome the limitations of our own weaknesses and selfishness and laziness and fears, and get us to do harder, better things than we can get ourselves to do on our own. And that, when I read that, grabbed me by the scruff of the neck and shook me around. And it's never let me loose. I think it's so powerful, and it seems even more to me resonant and relevant in this extraordinary kind of tsunami of crises that the world is caught up in right now.
Yeah, it did the same thing for me when I read it in your book. I'd never seen it before, and I went, wow, of all the definitions I've seen, that really resonated, especially the fact that it really is the opposite of a hierarchical definition, right, for the future, where, so much of our thinking in the past has been hierarchically based, right? And in this, anybody's a leader as long as you can influence the group to do something better than they did yesterday.
Absolutely. So librarians, police chiefs, right? Chemo nurses, all kinds of leaders come in many shapes and sizes. And David Foster Wallace's, writing about this definition helped me, just like you, Gary, really try and think about that and see that with new clarity.
Yeah, and it seems to me in a world where innovation is a more valuable currency, everybody on the team should have and could have a leadership role given that definition.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know, this better than I, because your field, your research is much more centered on this. You're much more of an expert, that diverse, relatively egalitarian teams where people feel authorized, empowered, inspired to take part and initiate innovative ideas are more creative and more effective, and ultimately for profit companies more profitable.
Yeah, and in your work with the five people that you studied in your work and the other work that you've done, I love the fact that you point out directly how leaders are not born, that they didn't get the leadership gene or the charisma gene, and that they actually evolved over time.
Yeah, I'm a voyeur of leaders. I study leaders and their teams, and have been for 20 years. And the more work I do, the more I'm so struck by this making, right? that nature is relevant, endowments are relevant, but they're a smaller piece of the pie of a leader than his or her ability to learn from failure, right? Get better and stronger when the stakes and the uncertainty rise. Inspire other people to do harder, better things. Learn from their experience how to build muscles of resilience. All these different aspects that go into making a leader who can help any group of people do harder, better things are largely learned on one's path, on one's leadership journey. And yet it still takes this incredible commitment on the part of the individual to keep getting better, to understand that he or she has that agency and to keep on falling back on it in order to really, I think, create people who are transformational leaders, iconic leaders.
And certainly you've studied those. And this inside out phenomenon that you talk about is part of that development process, right?
Yeah, it is. So that's something I never expected to unpack, Gary, when I began the detective work for this book, which began actually with Ernest Shackleton, who was the first story in Forged in Crisis. And I began work on the expedition, this Antarctic expedition in the early 20th century that results in disaster after disaster after disaster, in which before long, 28 men are stranded on a ship stuck on an iceberg with they certainly didn't have text messages or Waze or Facebook posts, right? They have no means of communication, and they're all the odds are against them. And the more I studied what Shackleton did, how he made the impossible possible, because he saved all his men. It took him a while, but he saved them all. The more I studied, the more I realized it wasn't, and this is, again, surprising from a Harvard Business School academic. I spent more time at the Harvard Business School than any other institution in my life. We teach a lot about outside forces, right? You manage competition. You manage, right, the larger political, economic environment as best you can. You have forces of competition that affect you and your company and your prospects. We think about outside in. And it turns out that in my work on the making of leaders, getting better, how leaders make themselves better and make the world better as a result, the initiating power begins within the leader. So it's what he or she does inside themselves, including their conversations and their moments of despair, and how they negotiate out of those moments. That all these things happen that enable them to inspire other people and then really push the boulder of a worthy purpose forward. And I didn't expect to find that, but once I did, I've seen it over and over and over again, and it holds true for leaders of lots of different walks of life and lots of different stages.
I think that's so true in most of our experiences, because at the end of the day, leadership can't be just some set of choices or situational choices or techniques. It's really a reflection of who you are when in crisis, right? It's who you are becomes front and center, and therefore being a great person doesn't guarantee you'll be a great leader, but certainly has to give you a leg up.
Well, it does in terms of your inner, I think, compass, right? Where you feel the need to take strong, worthy action, how committed you are to that action, right? Usually, almost always on the part of a lot of other people, and as again, a powerful purpose. And then how you inspire other people to dig deep and in a sense, rise, as Lincoln said in 1862, we must rise with the occasion. The occasion is piled high with difficulty. And so those things come from a willingness to walk into integrity, make your character better, right? Leadership is hugely about character and competence. Both of those things are not fixed in stone, as you said, by virtue of what kind of DNA code you have, and your ability to hear the call of this moment and what the real essence of the stakes are, right? So Lincoln, who had never managed anything more, say, than a two-person law office, right, when he's elected president, becomes someone capable of being at the eye of this extraordinary storm, a perfect storm, the Civil War, directing thousands and thousands of troops and millions of dollars, and ultimately pursuing a cause, initially save the Union, and then transform the Union, get rid of the cancer of slavery, figure out how Black Americans and white Americans will live together in mutual respect and mutual progress. And that's just such an extraordinary walking into the moment, stepping into the moment, and appreciating that the gravity left him no choice but to get a hell of a lot better.
And this stepping into it in crisis, as you looked at these things, seems to be an extraordinary look at leadership in a way that we often would say about athletes, that they step up in big moments or they become comfortable in their discomfort. They still have to be fearful, right? They have to, Shackleton had to know the odds are against
them.
him.
Oh my God, yeah.
Lincoln, and still they stood up. Did you get many hints as you studied the people that you studied, how they dug deep and what they thought about? Did they think about running like most of us would have about halfway
Oh yes. Oh yes. One of the most, so I should tell you as a kind of truth in advertising or full disclosure notice that I didn't, historians always work inductively. Like we're like, follow the money, follow the person, follow the information, follow the progress of events, the play unfolding. So we work inductively. So I didn't expect that I would end up with, as it turned out, about 8 or 9 leaders I could have used. And I ended up, because the book already took me 15 years, it was going to take me the rest of my life if I kept writing. I ended up with 5 leaders. I didn't expect to write a book about crisis leadership. That wasn't the goal. The goal was to find people who found themselves in some kind of greenhouse or crucible and then got better. And those turns out crises are actually a lot more fruitful. They're better greenhouses than actually moments of great success and great profit and great, a cornucopia of riches. So that's what happened. And I was in the midst of a series of unexpected, very serious personal crises. My father died. My husband walked out. I got cancer. I got cancer again. I lost all my money. I just had a kind of annus terribilis after annus terribilis for about 5 years. And it was then that I was really digging into what would turn out to be the meat of the book. And so I think, Gary, at a very personal level, I was interested in understanding, this is a long way of responding to your question, how they did get through those moments, why they didn't run, how they got stronger, how Lincoln, who talked about killing himself several times seriously during the Second World War, during the Civil War to close advisors, how he didn't, dive off the canyon of despair. I wanted to learn not only as a historian, not only as a leadership scholar, I wanted to learn for myself. I was like, these people were lighthouses for me. So that personal quest really helped me find the discipline and the detective work to unpack these stories. And yes, now to the answer, they all came really close to giving up on a number of occasions. They all wanted to flee. They all thought it was too hard. They all got depressed. They all, as I say metaphorically, and in several cases, literally got down on their knees. And here's the and they were very, very close to giving up. Everything, right, is in that fine line between I'm giving up and no, I'm just going to lift one knee up and try and stand and get through the next hour. And then I'll get through the next hour and then it'll be morning and that sleepless night will be over. And in those decisions, in these baby steps back into the work, back into the mission, lay in some cases the fate of 28 men, in the case of Shackleton, the fate of the United States and its future, the fate of the environmental movement if we talk about Rachel Carson, the fate of abolition if we talk about Frederick Douglass, and in some ways the fate of what Nazi Germany would come to be morally in the case of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And so I was so struck by how fine the line is between despair and eventual success. But it's there, and they are no different from us in those ways, except they took the baby step away from the cliff.
I love your comments about, I think it's attributed to Mandela when he says, we all feel the fear. They all had to be fearful at some point.
Oh.
And like they said that, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the understanding that something's more important. And this idea that you said that cause the nation, the 28 men that agreed to go on a crazy expedition to Antarctica in the early 1900s, there's a cause prepotent. And if I look around the world today, most people who work don't have the same level of cause. I mean, you see people say, why do we exist? Shareholder value. Well, I don't know anybody who walks out of a shareholder value thing go, well, I can't wait to sacrifice for that. How much more,
Yeah.
this idea of a cause has got to be fundamental to how we think about it.
It is fundamental. I think in many of these moments, these what I call, dark nights of the soul, to use a literary term, for each of these people, in many cases, not all, in many cases, it was the cause, the purpose, the mission that ultimately got them up on one knee and then and then standing up. But to your point, and to the larger body of your work, right? Choose love, not fear. I believe there's the possibility for valiant purpose in enormous number of endeavors, but the enormous number of endeavors. There's an old line, and it's probably apocryphal, but it's a great metaphor of Lyndon Johnson touring the Canaveral, soon to be Kennedy Space Center, in the mid '60s, and he passes a janitor, and he says to the janitor, "What are you doing?" And he says, "Well, sir, I'm helping get a man on the moon." So the idea that we all have a worthy purpose to be part of that's bigger than who we are, that's an incredibly motivating, incredible motivation, an incredible sense of connection to other people, and grounding as well. And so one of the things I think that leadership today, particularly during this crisis, when so much has been laid bare, when suddenly at one level we're down to the most basic fundamentals of life and death in some of the decisions that leaders are making and some of the decisions that countries are facing, but we're down to basics, essential values. This is a great time for leaders to think very seriously about what kind of purpose are my folks, marching with, or what kind of standard are they carrying, and what is the valiant aspect, or the noble aspect, or the honorable, that's a better word, what's the honorable aspect of what we're doing, and how do we do it honorably? There's such power in that, and yet that's not necessarily, this again better than not, it's not necessarily the kind of software that a lot of folks are operating in by inclination or instinct.
Yeah, I was once talking to a guy who took four companies public before his 40th birthday, and I asked him, he was in the software business. I said, "Come on, you're writing code, you're not curing cancer. The loyalty you're getting," and he said, "There is something immeasurably important about being the best in the world at what you do that attracts people, where people find meaning in being part of the best, working with the best, and just being proud of what they do in and of itself as a cause."
Absolutely. Don't you remember I don't know if they're still using it, but I remember years ago when we were doing a lot of work at Harvard Business School and the Ritz-Carlton Company, they had this wonderful internal, if you will, kind of mantra, which is the Ritz-Carlton is all about ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen. Or I think it was Scott Cook at Intuit saying to all his call center folks when the software was first launched, "We have our customers' money, we owe them success." So again, there are values, implicit but absolutely accessible values, worthy values in each of those companies laying out those kind of priorities, and they're powerful. And I think no one gets up in the morning and says, "I want to go the extra mile for shareholder value today." At least no one who's not holding a lot of stock in the company, which is the vast majority of employees.
And finding that meaning is critical.
Yeah.
Shifting gears just a hair, the number of billions of dollars we spend in leadership development, and you're right in the middle of this with a number of universities, we spend a lot of money trying to develop better leaders for decades. And as far as I can see, we're not making a lot of headway in creating a lot of substantially better leaders. What are we missing? What's the missing cog in the way we're going about trying to help leaders develop that we don't get the same level of result that we might have expected?
Well, first a qualifier on that, and then a response. I think there are leaders, I've said this for a long time, and it comes from studying all these different time periods, the stages on which these different people acted. I think all kinds of crises call forth leaders out of the mists. So Lincoln really came out of a mist in the middle of the 1850s. There was no reason he should have become a national figure, except that he saw the broad stage and wanted to play a part, driven hugely by narcissistic ambition that later transformed itself into a much more service-oriented motivation. But I think leaders come out of the mist all the time. We're seeing that now. Just think about Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand. Now, she came out of the mist last year in the Christchurch the mosque shootings last spring. We saw that, but we're seeing her kind of grow even stronger and more luminous, and I think more effective as a leader, both in terms of the way she's, providing brutal honesty and credible hope to her people, but also in terms of the action she's taking and this all-out full-court press against COVID in that country that's been remarkably successful. So leaders come out of the mist. So I think we probably haven't seen, and we're beginning to see in the form of young people, including people like Greta Thunberg. I mean, there's a crisis, slow burning, but probably faster burning every day, the climate crisis. And here comes a 17-year-old out of Stockholm, right, with a very complicated history and a lot of disappointment and real challenges. And she's lighting the world on fire on climate change. And she's just in the prologue of her story, right? We haven't got to chapter 1. So we want to be careful. Even those people aren't getting a lot of limelight by the chattering classes doesn't mean they're not out there. That's first thing. Second thing, I think to your question, I think one of the things we don't teach very well is we don't teach, in some sense, the kind of, right now, the kind of material we don't put our young colts and fillies, our older horses and mares, we don't put them into the right paddocks necessarily of learning. So, and these are the kind of paddocks you and I are interested in. So what is your purpose, right? What are the order of your priorities in terms of your assets? So I remember many years ago when no one had ever heard of Starbucks, this is 1996, and Howard Schultz, who I didn't know at all then, I came to know him actually pretty well over the ensuing 20 years, but his COO was a guy named Orrin Smith. He was an HBS graduate, so in a fit of madness, Orrin Smith said, sure, this junior faculty member can write a case about Starbucks. No one had hardly heard of Starbucks at that point on the East Coast. And Howard, takes like United Airlines coach out to, Boston and talks to a group of students. 70 showed up for him because no one had ever heard of him. And someone said, what are your priorities, Mr. Schultz? And he said, well, my priorities are very clear. They're my employees, in this, number 1, my customers, number 2, and 3, my shareholders. And if I deliver to those stakeholders in that order of priority consistently, everyone will win. So we don't even really expose our young leaders to those kind of frameworks. We don't expose them to a lot of history, right, in which you can start seeing these kind of, scripts of how leaders in greatly difficult circumstances made themselves better. We don't talk to them about emotional awareness. We don't talk to them about resilience. We don't teach them all the legs of the stools of character and emotional competence that help you to keep rising as a person and as a leader. And we need to do more of that because the world is now so tumultuous that good leaders can't be good without those kind of skills and access to the way they not just harness, but enhance and deepen those skills.
With an opportunity to try them out without such risk of failure that it becomes career limiting, right?
Absolutely, right? So that's a really important point, Gary. It's a really important. How many courses have you seen in leadership development academies, executive, company executive programs, Harvard Business School, Stanford? How many programs have you seen on the lessons of failure, right? We're going to spend now 3 weeks on failure. And we're going to study some failures, and then we're going to study and then we're going to look at, and you're going to write about and think about your failures. We do nothing like that. We spend a lot of time avoiding any mention of failure, whereas it turns out empirically the evidence is absolutely unequivocal. People grow much more through failure than they ever grow in all kinds of important positive ways through success.
I love your phrasing when you say setbacks are classrooms.
They are. They're important classrooms. And the power of the shame and the disappointment and the self-flagellation is what makes us porous and are able to absorb all kinds of lessons for how we won't let that happen again, and then back into, kind of like a little kid hitting a hot stove, right? You learn kind of by backing into, well, these are the things I'm going to do differently. These are the things I'm going to improve. These are the things I'm going to watch out for in the future, right? That is, those aspects, being able to do that are important. They're even more important, and again, periods in history when there's so much that's uncertain, like right now.
Yeah, and culturally though, we have inherited and perpetuated systems in
Absolutely.
organizations that make failure difficult. I mean, if we keep having implicit or explicit distribution systems and performance appraisals and stuff that punish people for failure, it would be nonsensical for them to be career limiting and experimental at the same time.
Exactly. Now, again, there's a fine line here, right? You can't sort of, issue a kind of CEO, kind of fiat that says all failure is fine, go fail and learn from it, right? You have to be careful, right? So it's like everything about really successful, really courageous leadership. This piece is all about deftness, right? How do you help people learn that failure is a great learning opportunity, that we're still working very, very hard to make the right, thoughtful decisions, all things considered, but that when we fail, we're not here to fail, but when we fail, we're going to learn really quickly from it, and we're going to study failure not as a way of encouraging it, encouraging it. We live in such a stark age. It's all about it's black or it's white. It's 1 or it's 1,000. We have so little room for the nuance that you have to be careful here, and it has to be well framed. But this is eminently doable for thoughtful leaders and their people. And I think I've done this kind of coaching, particularly one-on-one, but in small groups too. It can be extremely effective.
Yeah, and the learning part of it is really interesting with the way we deal with information. Even when studying your leaders in the book and Forged, it seems to me that they didn't wait for information to come to them. They sought it out all the time, and it was almost like flowing through their veins, where curiosity and learning were just part of who they were.
Could not agree more. It's such a good such a good pull from the book. Because I don't say it literally explicitly, but I often say to executives, I call this my lover, right? My iPhone, right? But here's how most of us get most of our information. We passively stroke our lover and look for what's coming across its screen, as opposed to pulling information, right? Then translating it into knowledge and possibly understanding and, dare I say it, wisdom. But all the leaders that I have studied who I think were courageous and effective with big worthy missions were people who pulled the information, and they didn't just pull it from one source. They pulled it broadly, and then they used their own kind of intellectual and emotional powers of integration to say, here's what the big picture looks like, and I have to be concerned with the big picture. I worry that we're so busy living with our necks in the position, stroking our phones, that we're living in these little kind of swim lanes or these tiny little bowling lanes that really don't have anything to do with what, right, the larger ecosystem looks like. And we all need to be thinking about the big picture here. It's tremendously important.
And the research that showed that the more information at our fingertips, the less we use it sometimes, and the more we tend to imitate others, was a bit counterintuitive to me, but seems to be true with your lover being at your hands all the time with his phone.
Right, and by the way, the lever isn't a discriminating advice. Apple does. You do not pay $1,000 to get Plato or Albert Einstein or Nelson Mandela or Katharine Graham curating thoughtful content coming at you, right? It's the whole kitchen sink, right? It's one big in some cases torrid garage sale, or one big global garage sale of lots of different items, many of them repulsive. Not all of them, but some of them repulsive and base. And so this idea about where am I pulling information, and how, and a lot of that comes from people, right? Not necessarily from your phone. How am I getting it? How am I putting it together, right? How diligent am I in constantly looking up and looking out? That's really important. And everyone I have studied, from Martin Luther King, who I'm reading a biography about now, and has been thinking a lot about. I teach about him in one of the courses I teach. To Greta Thunberg. I mean, these were people who just figured out that the stage is here, not here, and my part is here, not here.
I love the term looking up, because whether we call it just more aware, looking up, mindful, whatever word we want to put on it today, there's this not being on autopilot.
Yeah.
That is the best leaders I've been doing. They refuse to go on autopilot and do more of what they did yesterday. They're constantly looking up for information that'll show them a better way, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, in crises, they understand they're not going to get like a kind of GPS printout of what, where they go. 6 miles here, turn left, quarter mile, turn right. It just doesn't work like that. You're going to navigate point to point, paying lots of attention to looking up. And then when the seas change and the winds change and the storm intensifies, you're going to tack a different way, pivot and tack a different way. And you're learning at each of those moments, right? Facing forward, learning, but also able to pivot pretty quickly. And then, really important, able to communicate this to your people, because you're not sailing the ship alone. And so that's really important. And it's also really hard. This is really, a lot of what we're talking about is really hard.
Yeah, it is. And the communication part, you make a note that was very interesting to me about writing as an important part of communication.
So I didn't expect to discover this either, Gary. So I'm a writer, and I actually write mostly anything I really think it's important. I write in longhand to begin with, because I write more creatively. I'm less likely to think I've got it perfect here and go back and scratch something out, and then the next clearer sense of the idea comes to me. But in any event, all these people. So I write quite often, but I didn't expect to find that so many leaders I've studied, and it's true of many more that are in the book, they wrote. Now, they didn't write to be, with one exception in my book, Rachel Carson, they weren't writing to write books. They were writing as part of their they were writing for two reasons. One, as part of their leadership work, like Lincoln writing, letters to the editor and writing speeches, Douglas editing and writing his own newspaper, Dietrich Bonhoeffer writing sermons and writing books. But Ernest Shackleton, and this is the really most interesting thing I think probably for our audience here, he just wrote to help him think. Now, all these people wrote to help themselves think, to help themselves clarify, to help themselves kind of get grounded with what they really believed the right next move was and the mission was. But Shackleton wrote in his diary almost every day, certainly several times a week for all those many, many, many weeks stranded on the ice. And he didn't write because he was going to try and sell the diary. He was very commercially oriented, but that wasn't why he wrote this. He wrote because he wanted to puzzle out both emotions and more rational thinking about his situation and what he needed to do next. So, and I've worked with a lot of leaders. I urge everyone to buy a small notebook and start keeping your own leadership journal, in which you use this almost like a sounding board for yourself. Doesn't have to be, you're not writing treatises, you're not writing op-ed pieces. There's no word limit. You can write a scrawl of an interesting quote and a thought about that. Sometimes that can be the most productive thing you did this week, because of the thoughts that it awakens or unleashes inside you that can affect what you're doing and the people you're leading. So they all wrote.
And challenge their own thinking in the process.
There, you said it much more succinctly.
Yeah, hardly. I took it down as writing when I read it, and I went, my Lord, yeah, I could do more of that for sure. Yeah. Let's talk about how you show up, your words. There's an interesting part to me about showing up that is challenging, and I found myself thinking about your words. There's a passion for the cause that you have to have, or nobody's going to follow you, because if you're not excited about what you're doing, why should anybody else be? But on the other side of it, there's a temperance that you talk about, that you need to temper that passion as a leader at times, to not overreact, as in Lincoln, not overreacting to General Meade's reaction to the Confederate victory he had. Tell me about how you look at those two issues.
Sure. So again, it's based in, like so much of my work, in this inside out impulsion or energy behind what I'm doing. So it's incredibly important. The higher the stakes, the more stormy the weather, so to speak, that leaders show up in service to their mission. What do I mean by that? I mean that when you case of Shackleton, when he walked out of his tent every morning, even though we know from his diary, he didn't sleep well and he was worried. He didn't like walk out and say, lads, gather around. Let me tell you why I'm really worried. I don't think we can do this. And I couldn't sleep last night, right? There was, there's no Geraldo, right? There's no disgorging in emotional catharsis. Leaders don't have that luxury. They're safe, a few safe places, including their own journals where they can do that, and maybe a trusted partner or confidant. But leaders have to pick their own places to disgorge and have catharsis. And most of the time it isn't in front of your team. Right? You're not following someone who thinks it's all going to fall apart tomorrow. And every single person I've studied who was really good was conscious of this. That means you've got first the emotional awareness of what you're feeling, and then the emotional discipline, self-regulation to say, I'm not going to act on these feelings right now. I'm going to walk out of the tent, square my shoulders and say, lads, time for breakfast. Are we organized? Because today may be the day we go home, which is something he said over and over. So people take their cues, and not just from what they hear or see from a leader in terms of their, how they're, in what venue they're appearing to them. They take their cues from the energy of the leader, where your shoulders are, right? What your kind of body, kind of posture and bearing is. Those cues, your voice, the modulation, all of those cues are exceptionally important, particularly in times of crises. So good leaders understand that how you show up is part of how you communicate your message. And they have the self-discipline to do that, even if they're very strained inside at the time, right? And dying to disgorge, right? Their own fears, frustrations, etc., uncertainties. But there's another piece here to your point, and that is that you have to be, as a great leader, particularly in times of crisis, at some sense, you have to be the ballast. You have to be the still point in the turning world. And so you want to both have credible inspiration and what I call calculated empathy for your people, and credible hope. You have to have all of that. At the same time, you can't really fly off the center, right? You don't want to be a spinning top that wobbles, right, very fast away from a steady centrifugal center-placed orbit. People get nervous by that. So how do you find, right, the imagination in terms of how you need to appear, right, and the self-discipline in order to appear that way, so that, back to deftness, I always say leadership is much more like driving a fine stick shift car, like a fine, I don't know, I'm trying to think of the great Formula One cars, but a fine six gearbox car with a very delicate clutch that is like driving an automatic that you put on cruise control. So you need the deftness of, I want to inspire people. I want to provide credible hope. At the same time, I have to be grounded and temperate and very serious about brutal honesty about the difficulties we are facing as a team or a group or a nation. And so great leaders do all that kind of work to keep showing up that way. And it is, we know from every which way you study it, extremely powerful when people can do this.
One additional thing about the showing up that's implicit in what you're saying, I think, Nancy, is that when they show up and how they show up, this idea about how they show up reflects on how committed they are to the cause. There's a certain focusing part of that, right, that comes to the cause, that the way they show up shows their focus and their commitment to the looking out the windshield as opposed to the rearview mirror.
Absolutely. So in the case of Shackleton, again, just to go back, I mean, hearing a lot from people that are interested in leadership about Shackleton right now. I think partly because it was so stark on the ice, everything gets kind of put into very stark relief. Partly because it's life and death. Partly because the odds were so stacked against him and his men. I'm thinking and talking a lot about Shackleton. This is true of any leader we would want to talk about as well. But for example, with Shackleton, he understood that he had a small team. They're all living together in very, very difficult, circumscribed circumstances, limited circumstances on the ice together. But he would show up every day and understand how much distance to keep from a person, how close at times he would, if you will, come in to speak with them or express some, share some intimacy about poetry or the man's family or whatnot. And at the same time, he knew how to back up and give orders. And that's showing up, which again, appreciate the nuance here that he's thinking about. That's showing up in all kinds of ways, from my men's morale is low, because he was always managing morale, as every great crisis leader is doing. You're managing morale in a crisis, right? My men's morale is very weak right now, he knew. So 1 week in January of 1916, when they're running out of food, he orders up double rations for 3 days for his men. His quartermaster who manages supplies is all in a dither, right? Really upset. And Shackleton's like, I need mental medicine more than we can worry about the food supply right now. And so talk about hard choices, but that's showing up. Everything from he's managing morale to I want to talk to Orlees today about Shakespeare, because I know he loves Shakespeare. All those things are conveying a very important language about what he's trying to do and who he is as a leader. And all of that showing up, Gary, is about ultimately earning people's trust. Most of that showing up the most important purpose of it is earning their trust, that this is someone I can follow. This is someone who I can do harder, better things than I could get myself to do on my own. And that is so, so important. So last point. Many years after the Endurance expedition, which was the name of Shackleton's ship, got home safely in 1916, many years after they got home safely, the BBC, this is the early 30s, went back and interviewed a bunch of survivors, or a bunch of men still alive from the expedition. And they said, how'd you do it? How'd you survive? All those, it's like almost 2 years on the ice. And to a man, the men said, to a man, each person said, the boss, which was their nickname for the captain, for Shackleton, the boss made us believe we could do it. And a huge amount of harder, better things that the boss made them believe they could do was accomplished by how he showed up. So.
Wow. One last question about showing up. In the era we live in today, I'm really intrigued by the leader's responsibility in creating or fomenting social change outside the organization, or overcoming racial injustice, or different kinds of social issues that affect members of the organization in which we work, or as a greater society. Do you have some thoughts about what the leader's role is outside their organizations in fomenting this kind of social change or overcoming injustice?
I don't think that the world, so we're not moving to a new normal. We're moving into the post-COVID world. That's where we're headed. We're still heavily in a different kind of global conflict than World War II. We're in a global conflict against a virus that's as deadly as in some places, and with some statistics as international combat was in the 1940s, late 1930s. So we're moving into this post-COVID world. It is very clear to all kinds of thinking people from different walks of life that a bunch of big structural changes will need to be made, not only to prevent, right, the kind of destruction that we've seen in COVID, but to remedy, change, right, better the societies and polities and economies that COVID, those problems, those structural problems that COVID has made manifest. The word apocalypse in Greek, I learned this like the first week of lockdown, means revelation, which is a wonderful, little fun fact. So in a sense, the apocalypse or the crisis or the difficulty and the turbulence of COVID has revealed a whole bunch of really important stuff that needs to be changed. None of that change can happen, I think, Gary, not really, without a whole group of business leaders and business organizations deciding this is the future and we are going to march toward it, because it's the future and it makes moral, economic, and democratic or political, right, good sense. Right? This is a long view. We're playing the long game. Part of the reason this pandemic has been so destructive is because largely all countries across the world, including organizations, played very short games with supply chains, with public health, with a host of, the way information traveled to the centers of power around things like global pandemics, right? So, it's in China, we don't have to worry about it, said a lot of people around the world in early January of this year, or more foolish, more destructive words have not been uttered in some time. So how are we going to play the long game? I think that's a real, how's my company? What am I going to do with the authority and the influence I have? And that requires that we, as Lincoln would say, disenthrall ourselves from the idea that our job is to get back to where we were before COVID. The job was never for any thinking leader in 1944 to get back to 1938, right? The job was to move forward into the post-war world and to make things a whole bunch better so that a Hitler and a Stalin would never arise and unite and try and destroy the entire world order in such an extraordinarily immoral and terrible way. So that's not so dissimilar from where we are now. What is the new? What part will I play on the stage of rebuilding for the long game a better world, better for my business, better for my people, better for my country, better for the interdependence we so clearly see we have around the world?
Well said. Just well
so
said.
Important. So important.
So important. Couple quick questions, Nance, before we wrap it up. What are you reading?
I'm reading a couple of things. I'm reading, I mentioned this, I'm reading Bearing the Cross, which is a Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Martin Luther King by a guy named David Garrow, Garrow. I started reading it. I knew a lot about King. I knew a fair amount about the early years of King's early nebulous leadership in Montgomery, Alabama in the late 1950s. But I'm learning a lot more because I want to understand not just King, but I want to understand Rosa Parks, right? And Roy Wilkins and a host of other folks that were part of this, what became, world, country, nation changing movement, and the fellowship among them. So I'm reading that, and I started reading that as in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder. I'm also rereading, same topic, Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy, which is, if you don't know, it is a book by the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, an astounding Black American leader, about how he and others built an organization trying to fight discrimination in the racial discrimination in the justice system. And then last but not least, I'm rereading Jane Eyre because I have a real penchant for Victorian romances, which are wonderful moments of distraction and escape. And so when in doubt, give me Mr. Rochester and give me Plain Jane. So those are three of the books open on my bedside table. And I'm pretty seriously making progress in each one.
That's great. Two leaders, living or dead, who you had most admire or influenced your thinking. And I know maybe they come out of your book and maybe they don't, but the two that you think of that most influenced you.
Abraham Lincoln. I mean, I lived with Lincoln. I've lived with Mr. Lincoln. I never called him anything Mr. Lincoln for at least 20 years. I know him intimately well, which is an audacious thing for a lot of historians to say, except that I'm interested in his inner world and trying to understand that. So, and he's just made I think about him every day to day. Like, what would he make of the George Floyd murder, right? And the reaction to it. So I think Lincoln is right there at the top. And then, that's a very, I'm trying, perhaps Marian Wright Edelman. She's just been, someone we don't talk about a lot today, yet she's still an extraordinarily important and influential figure in child welfare. And she began her work as a spokesperson for America's poor in the 1960s. And I've never met her, but I've been, snooping and following her and being inspired by her bravery, her grit, passion, and persistence, her moral seriousness, right? The way she's grown into that, and she didn't start from way behind the start line to begin with, and her dignity. Both of these people I just mentioned were very dignified people. They're dignified. They showed up with dignity. They thought that dignity was an act of respect for other people. They lived their lives within that dignity. And I just think there's something I get personally inspired by watching just that in both these people, in Marion Wright Edelman and in Lincoln. I wish more people would be called to the power and respect and honor of just showing up with dignity. We're a little short on that, it seems to me, in our public agoras right now.
If you had just one piece of advice, just one, you had a Gen Z or millennial leaders that come up to you all the time, and one piece of advice that'll shorten my trail as a leader, what one thing would you tell me?
Don't settle for the simplistic. Don't settle for the simple dichotomy. Don't settle for us versus them. Don't settle for black versus white. Don't settle for this is absolutely terrible and this person is absolutely good. Look for the nuance. Learn, study. History is your best starting point here, so you can understand the complexity not only of a situation and different positions on a particular issue or person, but so you can understand your own humanity and how you can grow into the best person you are meant to be. You can't do that in a simplistic dyad world, and the internet and all of social media wants you to be in that us against them place. That is wrong, wrong, wrong. It can't steer you any place that's valiant and satisfying.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for a great book, but I have also something else to thank you for that will probably startle you a little. A long time ago, maybe when Lincoln was president, I was a navigator of a polar icebreaker in Antarctica, sitting in the middle of the Weddell Sea reading about Shackleton.
Oh my God, that's so great.
And thanks to you, one of the questions of my life is now answered. I wondered what kind of salesman Shackleton must have been to get a bunch of crazy people to get on a wooden ship and head for the ice floes of Antarctica, only to try to get through the ice floes to make an 1,800-mile trek or so on land. And thanks to your book, I found that crazy marketing actually can get crazy people to do crazy things. I thank you for that too.
Hire for attitude, train for skill. That attitude really mattered, Gary, as you say, really mattered.
And thank you for that. And thank you, WSB, for enabling another great conversation with a world-class thought leader. Thanks, Nancy.
Yeah,
and thank you guys
Gary.
for watching.